After the bombshell criminal charges that were filed against two members of the Duggars this past week.
I don't think there's any way any of us would have known that my brother's living such a secret life.
For 7 years, TLC broadcast the Duggar family into millions of American living rooms. Every Tuesday night, viewers tuned in to watch a family that seemed almost impossible. 19 children, one household, one set of unshakable values. They were wholesome, they were faithful, they homeschooled their kids, they courted instead of dated, they thanked God before every meal, and they smiled constantly for the camera. America loved them. TLC loved the ratings. And somewhere inside that picture-perfect home, children were being harmed. The network knew some of it and kept filming anyway. That is the story that has never been fully told, and that is exactly what we are doing today. If this kind of deep dive investigation is what you come here for, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button and turn on notifications, because we go places on this channel that other people won't. And this video, this one matters. Let's go back to the beginning, because the beginning tells you everything. Before there was 19 Kids and Counting, before there were spin-offs and wedding specials and courtship storylines that millions of people followed like a soap opera, before any of that, there was a Discovery Health documentary. The year was 2004. The Duggar family of Arkansas, led by Jim Bob and Michelle, agreed to let cameras into their home to document what life looked like with 14 children. 14 at the time. The special was called 14 Children and Pregnant Again, and it did exactly what reality television always does when it finds something genuinely unusual. It performed well enough to warrant more. The follow-up came, then another. Then, in 2008, TLC, which had by then absorbed the Discovery Health brand, launched a full series. They called it 17 Kids and Counting, because the number kept changing, and changing the number in the title became part of the brand itself. By the time the show ended, they were at 19. The title was updated accordingly. The cameras kept rolling. At its peak, 19 Kids and Counting was pulling in millions of viewers per episode. It was one of TLC's most reliable performers. And what TLC had understood, what they had correctly identified and packaged and sold, was that the Duggars represented something a very specific audience was hungry for. Conservative Christian values presented without apology. A father who led his household. A mother who joyfully accepted every pregnancy. Children who were modest, obedient, cheerful, and seemingly content. No dating, no drinking, no worldliness. Just faith, family, and an ever-growing headcount. The network positioned them as aspirational. This was not an accident. The framing was deliberate. The Duggars were not presented as a curiosity. They were presented as a model. A lifestyle that some viewers found radical and others found inspiring. Either way, people watched. And watching meant advertising revenue. And advertising revenue meant TLC had every reason to keep this family on television for as long as possible. So they did. Now here is where the story stops being about ratings and starts being about responsibility. Josh Duggar, the eldest child, the one who grew up on camera, the one who became the face of the family's public engagement, had, between 2002 and 2004, some of those girls were his sisters. He was a teenager at the time. His parents became aware of it. They handled it internally within their church community, without involving law enforcement in any meaningful or legally proper way. In 2006, a police report was filed, but the officer who took the report was himself later convicted of child pornography charges, and the investigation went nowhere. The report, however, existed. It was a public record. The show launched in 2008. This is the timeline that demands scrutiny. 4 years pass between the end of the documented episode of 17 Kids and Counting. 4 years in which a police report sat in an Arkansas database. 4 years in which TLC, or Discovery Health, or whatever entity was doing pre-production on this family, had the opportunity to discover what had happened inside that home. Did they look? Did anyone run a background check? Did any producer, any network executive, any standards and practices department ask the basic question that should be asked before you put a family with minor children on national television? Is there anything in this family's history that we need to know? We do not have a definitive answer to that question. TLC has never provided one. What we do know is that the police report was accessible. What we do know is that in the years that followed, no one at the network surfaced it, acted on it, or disclosed it. And what we know with absolute certainty is that the show went on. This matters enormously, because what happened next was not a brief moment of filming before anyone could have known. It was 7 seasons long. 7 seasons of a show in which Josh Duggar appeared regularly, was featured in storylines, was presented as a responsible older brother, a godly young man, an example of what the Duggar family stood for. He worked for the Family Research Council, he gave interviews, he smiled at the camera, and his sisters, the girls who had been harmed, also appeared on camera, regularly. They smiled too. They answered questions about their lives. They performed the version of their family that TLC needed them to perform. They had no public voice of their own. They had no platform to speak from except the one their family and their network controlled. They were minors. They were, in the most uncomfortable reading of this situation, being used as entertainment by a network that was, at minimum, not asking the questions it should have been asking. Let's talk about what due diligence actually looks like in television production, because this is something the industry does not like to discuss. When a network produces a reality show involving children, and 19 Kids and Counting featured minors in almost every episode, in intimate family situations, in their bedrooms, in their kitchen, in their church, there is an implicit responsibility that attaches to that. We are not talking about a legal standard that is clearly defined and universally enforced, because one of the most important things to understand about reality television is how deliberately unregulated it has been allowed to remain. Child labour laws in the United States, which were largely written to address scripted entertainment, have enormous gaps when it comes to unscripted content. In many states, a child appearing in a reality show has fewer legal protections than a child actor appearing in a film. Fewer requirements around working hours, fewer requirements around financial protections, and almost no requirements around psychological safety. But legal minimums are not the only standard. There is also the question of what a responsible organisation ought to do when it invites children into a professional relationship that will broadcast their lives to millions of people. Background checks, interviews, conversations with the children themselves, not just their parents, about what they want and what they understand about what is happening. These are not radical ideas. These are basic practices of responsible production. TLC did not demonstrate them here, and the result was 7 years of content in which victims of their abuse camera that their network controlled, while their network collected the advertising revenue that their presence generated. That is not a small thing. That is an ethical collapse at the centre of what reality television. Production can become when profit is the only discipline it answers to. And then came May 2015. In Touch Weekly, a tabloid publication, obtained the 2006 police report. They published it. The report detailed what Josh Duggar had done. It named him. It was specific. And within days, it had become one of the most widely discussed stories in American media. The pressure on TLC was immediate. Viewers were furious. Advertisers began pulling out. The question of what the network knew and when it knew it was being asked loudly and publicly for the first time. TLC's initial response was to pull episodes from the air, not cancel the show, just quietly stop broadcasting new content while they assessed the situation. They issued a statement that was notable for what it did not say. It expressed concern for the girls, unnamed, voiceless even in the statement about their own harm, and said nothing about accountability, nothing about what the network had or had not known, nothing resembling an apology. In July 2015, 2 months after the story broke, TLC cancelled 19 Kids and Counting. This is the moment the network would like you to focus on, the cancellation, the decisive action. But look at the timeline again. They did not cancel the show the day the report was published. They waited, they assessed, they calculated. And when the calculation came back showing that advertisers were gone and the audience was divided and the legal exposure was becoming uncomfortable, they cancelled. The cancellation was not accountable. It was a business decision made under duress. There was no apology to the victims. There was no public acknowledgement of what those years of filming had meant for the people who lived through them. There was no commitment to doing things differently. There was just a quiet end to a show that had become a liability. And then, almost immediately, there was a new show. Counting On launched in late 2015. The premise was simple. Remove Josh from the frame and continue filming everyone else. The other Duggar siblings, the daughters, the sons, the ones who were now courting and marrying and starting families of their own, were still compelling television. They still had an audience. TLC still had a contractual and financial relationship with the family. And so the cameras came back. Think about what this decision communicates. A show had just been cancelled because it emerged that within the family it documented. The network's response to that cancellation was to launch another show about the same family. Not after a period of reflection, not after any public process of accountability, almost immediately. Counting On ran for 11 seasons. It aired until 2021. 6 years of additional Duggar content generated after the first scandal, collected and broadcast and monetized by the same network that had just claimed, through the act of cancellation, that it cared about what had happened. The financial calculation was not hidden. It was visible to anyone who was paying attention. TLC had determined that the Duggar audience was not going to disappear just because Josh had been removed from the screen. They were right. Counting On drew viewers, it drew advertisers, it made money. And the network's relationship with this family, a family in which harm had occurred, in which that harm had been concealed, in which the concealment had been made easier by the existence of a television platform that needed them to appear normal and happy, continued for 6 more years. This is where the story gets even more complicated, because Counting On was not just a continuation of the brand, it was, in some ways, a deeper entanglement. The show followed the adult Duggar children into their own families. It filmed courtships and engagements and weddings and pregnancies and births. It presented a new generation of Duggar life as wholesome and aspirational, just as the original show had done. And some of what it filmed was happening at the same time as events that would later become the subject of serious legal scrutiny. That is where we are at the end of part 1. The network that positioned a family as a model. The backgrounds they apparently did not find or did not disclose. 7 years of filming that included both the perpetrator and his victims. A cancellation driven by business calculation rather than moral clarity. And a spin-off that extended the relationship by 6 more years. In part 2, we go further. We look at what was happening inside the Duggar world while Counting On was still airing. We ask the questions about legal accountability that no one in the industry wants to answer. We hear from the people, advocates, former cast members, child protection experts, who have been trying to change the way reality television treats the children it profits from. And we ask the question that sits at the centre of all of this. Should TLC be held accountable? And if so, by whom and how? Part 2 is coming. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss it. And if this video has made you think, if it has made you angry or sad, or just more aware of something that deserved more attention than it got, share it. Because that is how these conversations grow. When Counting On launched in late 2015, TLC made a very specific editorial and financial decision. They decided that the Duggar story was not over. They decided that the audience was still there, that the brand still had value, and that by removing Josh from the frame, they could continue extracting content and revenue from a family that had just been at the centre of one of the most disturbing revelations in reality television history. What they did not decide was to ask harder questions. What they did not decide was to look more carefully. What they did not decide was to put the well-being of the people they were filming above the interests of their programming slate. And that decision, that set of priorities, is what allowed Counting On to run for 6 more years. Let's talk about what was happening inside the Duggar world while those cameras were still rolling. Joseph Duggar is one of Jim Bob and Michelle's sons. He appeared on Counting On. His courtship with Kendra Caldwell was filmed. Their engagement was filmed. Their wedding, a large, joyful, very Duggar event, was filmed and broadcast to the show's audience. Their children were born during the run of the show, and those pregnancies and births were filmed too. Joseph and Kendra were, in many ways, the kind of storyline that Counting On was built around. A young Duggar couple building a new life, reinforcing the family's values, giving the audience something to root for. What the audience was not told, what TLC did not address, did not investigate, and did not disclose, was that during the period Counting On was airing, serious allegations were being made about conduct within the broader Duggar circle that went far beyond what had already become public. The network was filming a family in real time, profiting from their image, and either not asking questions or not sharing answers. This is the pattern. It is not a one-time failure. It is a pattern. And patterns in corporate behaviour are not accidents. They are policies. They are the result of decisions made at the level of network leadership about what questions are worth asking and what answers are worth acting on. At TLC, across more than a decade of Duggar content, the answer to both of those questions was apparently not many and not enough. In June 2021, Josh Duggar was arrested by federal authorities. He was charged with receiving and possessing. The charges were serious. The evidence, as it would emerge at trial, was overwhelming. He was convicted in December 2021 and later sentenced to more than 12 years in federal prison. TLC cancelled Counting On in July 2021, 1 month after the arrest. Read that sequence again and let it settle. The show ran from 2015 to 2021. It was cancelled not after a period of network reflection, not after an internal review of how the Duggar relationship had been managed, not after any public accountability process. It was cancelled 1 month after a federal arrest made continuing the show literally impossible to justify to advertisers and audiences. This was the second time TLC cancelled a Duggar show in response to external legal pressure rather than internal ethical judgment. First in 2015, when a tabloid published a police report they apparently had not found. Then in 2021, when federal agents made an arrest they could not ignore. Twice, the network's moral compass pointed in the direction that financial survival required. Not once did it move on its own. That is the record. That is what more than a decade of Duggar programming looks like when you strip away the soft lighting and the family prayers and the counting of children. It looks like a corporation that continued a profitable relationship until the cost of continuing exceeded the cost of stopping, and called that decision accountability. Now let's ask the question the industry really does not want asked. What legal and ethical obligations do television networks actually have to the people they film, especially when those people are children? The honest answer is far fewer than most viewers assume. Child labour law in the United States was developed largely in response to the industrial era, factories, mines, agriculture. When Hollywood emerged and began employing child actors, specific protections were developed for that context: limits on working hours, requirements for unset tutors, financial protections like the Coogan Law, which mandates that a portion of a child performer's earnings be held in trust. These protections exist. They are imperfect, but they exist. Reality television, however, has spent decades arguing, successfully in most legal contexts, that the children appearing in unscripted content are not performers in the legal sense. They are not actors. They do not have agents. They do not have contracts in their own names. They are, legally speaking, members of a family that has entered into a contractual relationship with a network, and their presence on screen is treated as incidental to that family's participation, rather than as a professional engagement in its own right. What this means in practice is that a child who appears in hundreds of episodes of a reality television show, whose face is known to millions of people, whose life events are broadcast for public consumption, may have no legal protections whatsoever beyond whatever their parents have negotiated on their behalf. And when the interests of the parents and the interests of the child diverge, as they did in the Duggar situation, there is no legal structure designed to protect the child, no guardian ad litem, no independent advocate, no requirement that anyone ask the child, separately from their parents, what they want, what they understand, and whether they consent to what is happening to them. This is not a Duggar-specific problem. It is an industry-wide problem that the Duggar case illustrates with particular clarity, because in this case, the gap between what was presented on screen and what was actually happening in those children's lives was not small, it was vast. And the network filming them had every incentive to preserve the presentation and no legal obligation to investigate the reality. Child safety advocates have been raising this issue for years. The conversation tends to intensify after a scandal and then fade when the next programming cycle begins. But people who work in child protection and child media advocacy have been consistent in what they say. Reality television has constructed a system in which families are content, children are props, and the network's legal exposure is carefully minimised, while its profit is carefully maximised. Several former reality television participants, not from the Duggar show specifically, but from the broader genre, have spoken about what it feels like to grow up on camera, the loss of privacy, the inability to develop an identity separate from the one the show creates for you, the experience of having your childhood archived and broadcast without your meaningful consent, the difficulty as an adult of separating who you actually are from the character the cameras decided you were. For the Duggar children, this dynamic was compounded by something most reality TV participants do not face: the presence of active harm within the family that was being filmed, and a platform that made it structurally impossible for the victims to speak about their experience publicly. The show required the family to present as unified, faithful, and well. Any deviation from that presentation was a threat to the show's premise. And the show's premise was the family's livelihood. That is an enormous amount of pressure to place on a child who has been harmed and has no independent voice and no external advocate. The sisters, the young women who had been did speak. Jill Duggar Dillard, in particular, has been public about the ways in which her upbringing and the experience of being filmed shaped her. She has spoken about financial exploitation, about control, about the gap between the family's public image and private reality. She wrote about it. She has given interviews. And what she describes is a system, not just a family, but a system that included the television network, in which her autonomy and her well-being were secondary to the production of content. That testimony matters. It is not abstract. It is a person who was there, who was filmed, who was harmed, describing what that experience was. And TLC has never formally responded to it, never acknowledged it, never apologised for it. There have been legislative efforts to address the gap in child protections in reality television, and they have been slow and largely insufficient. California, which is the state most relevant to entertainment production, has taken some steps. In 2023, legislative attention turned more seriously to the question of minors in online content, specifically children whose parents monetize their lives on social media. And some provisions were enacted around financial protections and the right of those children as adults to have content removed. These are meaningful steps in the context of influencer and family vlogging culture, which is essentially reality television produced at home without a network intermediary. But the network-produced reality television space remains significantly under-regulated. There is no federal law requiring background checks before minor children are featured in unscripted programming. There is no federal requirement for independent psychological support for child participants. There is no mandatory disclosure process through which minor cast members are informed of their rights or given independent counsel. The industry has resisted all of these measures consistently on the grounds that they would make unscripted production unworkable. What they mean, translated from lobbying language into plain speech, is that regulation would make it harder and more expensive to film families. And filming families is enormously profitable. The resistance to child protection measures in reality television is a financial position dressed up as a creative freedom argument. And it has worked for decades because the political will to confront it has never quite matched the industry's will to avoid it. So where does all of this leave us? TLC made money from the Duggar family for more than 15 years. They made money while a police report about was sitting in a public database. They made money while the victims of that smiling, performing the version of their lives that the network needed to see. They made money through a cancellation, through a relaunch, through another 6 years of content, and through a second cancellation that happened only when a federal arrest made continuing impossible. They have never been held legally accountable for any of this. No lawsuit brought against TLC by the Duggar victims has resulted in a judgment against the network. No regulatory body has investigated TLC's practices in relation to the Duggar children. No congressional hearing has called network executives to answer for what they knew and when they knew it. The network issued vague statements in 2015 and went quiet. Then they launched a new show. Then they went quiet again. The mechanism by which a corporation like TLC gets held accountable, if it gets held accountable at all, is public attention. It is the accumulation of awareness, of documented record, of audiences and advertisers and legislators who understand what happened and decide that the cost of ignoring it is too high. That is a slow and imperfect mechanism. It does not deliver the clean resolution of a courtroom verdict, but it is the mechanism that is available. And that is exactly why videos like this one exist. Let's be precise about what this video is arguing, because precision matters. This video is not arguing that TLC caused in the Duggar family, a person within a family in a context that existed before. Cameras arrived and would have existed without them. The responsibility for that harm belongs to the people who committed it and the people who concealed it. What this video is arguing is that TLC had obligations it did not meet, that the network had the resources and the access to ask questions it did not ask, that when it made the decision to broadcast their entertainment, it made an ethical choice, whether it understood it that way or not, that deserves scrutiny. That the decision to launch Counting On, to continue filming this family after the first scandal, to cancel only when legally and commercially forced to, represents a corporate behaviour pattern that should not simply be absorbed into the background noise of the next programming cycle and forgotten. The Duggar case is the most visible example of a broader problem, but the broader problem is the one that will keep producing new examples until the industry is forced, by law, by public pressure, or by both, to treat the children it films as people with rights rather than as content with ratings. There are things you can do that are not nothing. If you follow family content creators on any platform, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, ask yourself what you know about whether the children in that content have meaningfully consented to being there. Ask yourself who benefits financially from their presence and whether any of those financial benefits flow to them in a protected way. Ask yourself what happens to those children when the cameras stop, when the audience moves on, when the family's brand no longer generates the income it once did. Support organisations that advocate for child performers and child media participants. When legislation comes up in your state or at the federal level that would extend protections to minors in unscripted content, pay attention to it. Contact your representatives. The industry counts on public disinterest to keep the regulatory environment comfortable for production. Public interest is the counter to that. And keep watching content that asks the questions the industry would rather not answer. Not because any single video changes a corporation's behaviour, it does not, but because the accumulation of attention, of documented record, of audiences who understand what they are looking at, is the pressure that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. TLC made millions from the Duggar family. They filmed through one scandal, launched a spin-off after another, and cancelled only when federal charges made it impossible to continue. The network has never been held accountable, not legally, not publicly, not in any way that has cost them anything proportional to what the people they filmed paid. This video is part of the record. It is part of the accumulation. And if it reached you, and if it made you think, and if you share it with one person who did not know this story, then it did what it was supposed to do. Every video on this channel is built the same way this one was. Primary sources, documented timelines, no sensationalism, no filler, just the story told completely and honestly, because that is the only way it is worth telling. Like this video if it gave you something. Share it if you think someone else needs to see it. And leave a comment. Tell me what part of this story hit hardest for you, because those comments shape what we investigate next. The conversation about reality television and child protection is long overdue. We just had part of it. See you in the next one.